Now that you've had a chance to get your feet wet working with R, it's time to talk about some intermediate R topics. So I've got a list of the topics here. So packages, getting your data into R, good habits, project organization, code organization, and then getting help. So with all of these, hopefully your R foo will get stronger. So packages. So I mentioned this in some of the previous videos, but I want to just reiterate here that when you need a package, you only need to install that package on your computer once. So you only need to run install.packages once if you're working with a new package. But then you do need to source packages each time that you restart RStudio. So we worked with the mass package, we installed it. Now it's installed on your computer. So if you reload R and you need to work with something from the mass package again, all you need to do is you need to have this library function in your code. So it'd be library mass. Okay, so now I need to talk a little bit about getting your data into R, because as much fun as it is to play with some of the data sets that are in R to begin with, in the long run our goal is to get your data into R so you can start graphing your own data and doing statistical analyses on your data. So for this process, you will start out with your data in a spreadsheet, and there's some particular formatting requirements for your spreadsheet that you need to keep in mind. So the first one is that you need to check and make sure that there aren't any special characters in your spreadsheet file. So all those special characters can wind up causing problems once you start importing stuff into R. Most importantly, if you have commas in your spreadsheet or extra pound symbols or hashtags, those can cause a lot of issues when you get your data into R. So get in the habit of eliminating those when you are entering your data into a spreadsheet. Then your spreadsheet needs to contain just the data. So blank rows and columns can cause a huge problem, and sometimes Excel will add a bunch of extra rows at the end of your file. So often you may have to go through and delete out those blank rows to get your data to read in correctly. Otherwise you're going to wind up with a lot of extra entries. Take out any lengthy notes you might have. If you've run some initial statistical calculations, you need to take those out. All those calculations need to come out, because otherwise they're going to start interfering with what you're trying to accomplish. Then you can only have a single header row, so that's one row at the top of your data file that has short names for your columns. And you want those column names or those headers to be short and descriptive, because you're going to wind up typing them over and over and over again. So if they are very long, you're going to be doing a lot of extra typing, and it's easier to make mistakes if you do a lot of extra typing. And in general, you should also try to avoid spaces. R will still read in the spaces, but it's going to replace them with a period. So it's just easier if your names don't have spaces in them. So if you do want some kind of division, you can use the underscore symbol, so first underscore name, or you can use something like camel caps, which I've shown you previously. So here's first name, or you could use first dot name to space out letters. And avoid starting names with a number. So if you had first day, that's going to wind up getting imported as X first day anyway. So R can't handle numbers for headers. And then you should also check to make sure that all of the values in a given column are of the same type. So here's why. If you have multiple types in one column, when that gets imported into R, the default behavior is usually going to be to interpret that column as a character. And then it's not going to behave the way you want it to. So in general, if you sneak some letters into a column where there are mostly numbers and you want it to be numeric, take those letters back out, make sure everything in that column is a decimal number, and then R will default to interpreting that as numeric. Same thing with integers, just make sure it's pure integers in that column. And factors are usually a little bit easier to import. Okay, so let's take a look at a practice example. Okay, so here is my practice example. So I've got a fairly busy computer here, but I've got everything for this fall in the folder. And here's my Bio 190 folder. And the file that I'm after is in this folder called lecture slides. So this I've named Excel data, not a very descriptive name. So let's take a look at this. So when this opens up in Excel, here's what I've got to begin with. So this is information about a bunch of people. And from this, hopefully you can see that I may wind up running into some mistakes when I go to read this into R. But we're going to try with it anyway and just kind of see what comes out. So it'll be easiest to start with an Excel file of some sort or another. I'll show you why in a moment. Okay, so that's my Excel file. So I'm going to go over to RStudio and we're going to walk through the instructions that are on this page here. So we don't need to refer to that page. Okay, so here we are in RStudio. And when I open up RStudio, by default, down here in the lower right, where we've been looking at plots previously, there's a tab for files. And the default is to start up in my home directory. So here's the names of the folders in that home directory. So first thing I need to do is navigate to where I've stored that particular file. So that's in Documents, then it's Me, and then it's in Sienna 2020, 190, lecture slides. So here's my Excel data file. If I click on this, that's going to open a little menu that will let me import that data set. So I'll click that. And RStudio is going to generate a preview window. And this preview window is already showing me there may be a couple of things that are a problem. So here are my headers. And my first header is ... 1, ... 2, ... 3, and then it's federal ... So here off the bat, I have the issue already of not having a single header row. So we need to go back and fix that to get this to import correctly. It looks like things are otherwise loading in okay, except that you'll notice this is telling me this column is loading as a character. Okay, that makes sense for names. But sex should probably load as a factor, but it's not giving me that option. And that's probably because there's something else going on. Aha, so down here I've got some numbers in this column. So I've got a lot of issues here. I'm going to ignore some of that for the moment and keep forging ahead. The other things I want to point out are there are some options down here. So for example, right now, if I had row number 2 as my top row, I would want that first row as names. This is going to open the data viewer by default, and it's going to name this data file Excel data. And I'll just note that Excel data is a pretty generic name, so it might be useful to give this a more specific name. So this might be demographics or something like that for this data set. And then this is also showing me a preview of the code that's going to run to import this data set. So again, I'm just going to blindly forge ahead, even though I know there's some issues with this data file and import. And so what R has done is it has run those lines of code. And one thing that you can then do is you can take those lines of code, copy them, then paste them into a script file. We'll take that caret symbol off. And then the next time you need to load this data file, you can just run these lines of code up here in your script instead of having to click around a whole bunch. Okay, so that's loading data in. Now, what if you make a plot of some sort and you want to save it into the same folder? So there's a nice way to do that, which involves going up to check the session window for RStudio. And it's off screen here, but at the top of your screen you should see a session window. And then you'll see an option to set your working directory. And we want to set that to the Files pane location. So that is where we've currently navigated to. So I'm going to click that, and that's going to also put another line of code down here, the setWD function. And I can do the same thing there if I want to be able to navigate to this folder more quickly next time. I can copy that and then paste it into my script file. And then if I close out of R and I reopen R and I reopen this script file, I can just run that line of code and I'm automatically in this folder. So the main reason that could matter is if you're generating a bunch of plots and you want to save those plots somewhere where they're organized, this is going to let you save all those plots directly into this folder. All right, I'm back over now to that Excel file. I've copied it. I made a new one called Excel Data Clean just to show you what it looks like if it's imported cleanly. So let's go through and do some quick cleanup. So I'm going to delete this top row. I've got a phone number here, but I've got a hashtag symbol. I'm just going to put that as phone. I've got a comma, a straight comma here. So I'm going to just change that to captured and released. I've calculated a bunch of numbers down here at the bottom, and I think that's really causing a lot of problems, so I'm going to delete that out. And at this point, it looks like my data set is pretty clean. So I'm going to save this, close, we'll go back over to RStudio, and here's Excel Data Clean. Let's try importing. I'll just leave the name the same this time. And now my names are showing up in the top row. And males and females are still showing up as a character. So we might have to change that later to a factor instead. It might be, sometimes if there's a stray space, the spaces matter when you're reading in your data. So it might be something like that. They can be a real headache. And it looks like other things here, they're still reading in as characters in some columns. So you can change that manually here as for a number of those, potentially. But overall, it looks like these are going to import more cleanly. Okay, there are still some warnings showing up. So let's see what those... Expecting numeric got a date. So I still have some work to do to clean up this data frame. But it's worth the time to get your data entered in nicely so that it's handled easily getting into R. Okay, so that's getting your data into R. So our next topic here, I want to talk a little bit about good coding habits, because these are things that make your code more readable, both by you and by other people who might be reading your code. And they're going to save you a lot of frustration down the road. So the first thing is, when you are naming your files, your R script files, they need to end in .r, and you need to give them meaningful names. So the name that describes what is in that script file. So here's a script where I'm going to evaluate some risk, .r. So, file.r, not informative. So be as specific as you can about your file name. And I typically like to append the date that I created a file, just to help me keep things a little more organized. When you are naming your objects or your variables, use meaningful names and don't use the names of pre-existing functions. So the worst thing you could do is name an object data, because data is already a function and that's very generic. So you want to name something variable.name, variable name, or something else that is meaningful about those data. Try to keep it short too. We're not going to be writing functions in this class, but if you were to write functions, functions should be named with action verbs. So get weights would be good for a function name, whereas weights suggests something that's more of a variable instead. Spacing. So when you're reading in data, R cares a lot about whether there are spaces in your cell entries. So that can cause a lot of problems. But once you are in R, R actually ignores spaces. So you can use spaces to help make your code more readable. So one of the conventions is to put spaces around the binary operators. So your equal sign, plus sign, minus sign, your assignment operator. Put put spaces around those. And just as you would for sentences, put a space after a comma, but you don't need to put a space before a comma. So again, this is about readability. And you can also use those extra spaces to align lines of code. You want to avoid using tabs, just use spaces to keep things vertically aligned. This is one that can get kind of confusing. The arrow symbol I've showed you and the equal sign actually are both assignment operators. So that can cause a lot of headaches. You need to be really specific in how you use them. So I've showed you already how to use the assignment operator, right? So use this for assignment when you're doing an assignment. So here I'm making an object called normDist, and I'm assigning the output of the rnorm function to normDist. And then inside of the function, for the function arguments, I'm using the equal sign. So this is saying assign the mean to 10, assign the standard deviation to 1, but following this convention just makes everything much easier to read. Next up, comment your code. You can put shorter comments on the same line as some of your code. Usually you want to put 2 to 4 spaces after the code and then hashtag space comment. That's fine. Or put longer comments on a separate line. You've seen us put in a lot of comments in our examples so far, and you need to include comments also. It's just like keeping good notes in your lab notebook. Good commenting habits make it a lot easier to go back and find things in your code later on. And a lot of this is that if you have a consistent style for your script, it's a lot easier for us to focus on what you're saying and not how you're saying it. And that consistency also makes it a lot easier to write code, because then you don't have to make as many decisions. Just follow these conventions and you're good to go. So that's some good coding habits. I also want to talk a little bit about digital project organization. So, and like this saying says here, organized people are just too lazy to look for things. It's really true. Good organization makes it a lot easier to retrieve things when you need it. So here is kind of an example of directory organization to keep a project organized, such as your experiment for this class. So what you'll notice here are the data are kept in one folder. There's another folder for figures. There's a folder for the literature. And then there's a folder for R scripts also. You don't have to use this exact structure, and I don't actually use this exact structure, but it gives you an idea about how you might organize things so that it's easier to relocate something, start something back up, or retrieve something when you need it. I'll show you an example of one of my projects just for fun. So this is a project working with leafcutter ants. Let's see. And this is a project that I've kind of worked on and off over time. So what you'll notice here is I've got a bunch of raw data in one folder. So these are data files that I don't touch after I've finished working with them. I even have some data sheets that I scanned in. So these were a hard copy that got scanned in, and then I typed them in into spreadsheets. Then I also have a file here for figures. And so here are some figures that appear in this paper that I've written. And you'll notice one thing I like to do is I don't like to get rid of stuff, but oftentimes I'll make too many different versions of something and I won't want to look at the older versions. So I've got an old folder here that has a bunch of old junk in it, just in case for some reason I decide I want to use it. And I've got to say, I almost never go back into those files, but I still feel a little peace of mind having them. Then I've got a folder here that has materials for the actual manuscript itself, so the figures as in the manuscript. And then same thing here, I have previous drafts. So you notice there's a lot of drafts in here for this paper. And then a couple of the final steps for assembling all the different pieces of these papers for publication. And then I've got an R script file. So, and this also has, an old, and it has a whole bunch of different things in it, because this is a very complex project with a lot of analysis. So you can see that if I hadn't organized this, I would have a pretty awful time trying to figure out where I left off the last time I worked on this project. So it really has saved my bacon to be very organized in how I maintain files on my computer. All right, so work on those habits. It takes practice, but it really pays off. All right, so along with all this, I also recommend developing an organizational system for your scripts. So think about organizing your script into sections. So for example, I often like to start my scripts with a header section that just contains some kind of narrative information about what that script is about, when I made it, and that I was the author of that script. Then the next thing you generally want to do within a script are load the packages that are needed for that script. So you're going to have a set of library commands to load those packages. After that, have some lines of code for reading in all of the data used in that script. Then after that, I'll generally have a section where I do any calculations that I need to do. So kind of like with the anorexia data where I wanted to calculate mass changes, that would go in the calculations section. Then after that, I'll start making my plots. And then after that, I will calculate my statistics. And as I'm noting here, use white space and the comment symbol dividers strategically. So you can divide sections with a bunch of pound symbols or other symbols. And again, comment your code. All right, so one other thing that's going to happen sooner or later is you're going to hit a wall of some sort. And it's very normal to have that happen. The funny thing about coding is it's very, very efficient until you run into a problem, and then you can wind up sitting there for a long time not knowing how to make any progress. So one simple resource, Google can be your friend. Google blah, blah, blah in R, and oftentimes you'll pretty quickly get to information that will help. Also, realize that a lot of error messages are the result of typos or incorrect syntax. So you'll want to go back through your code and look for those issues first. So look for spelling mistakes, punctuation problems, and other syntax issues. So, ask yourself, did I close all my parentheses and brackets? Do I have too many parentheses and brackets? Am I missing any commas? And are all my quotation marks in the right place? And RStudio is color-coded, as you can see here, to kind of help show you where you might be going wrong. And RStudio will also autofill a lot of things to help you catch many of those mistakes, but they can still very much happen. And also, capitalization also really matters. So if something's capitalized, it's not the same object as if it's lowercase. So check for capitalization. Another place you can sometimes look for more information is the help documentation. So let's say I'm starting to work on plotting and I'm getting stuck on plotting. So what I can do is I can type in help, and then I'm just going to type in the name of the plot function. And I'll run that line of code. And that's going to pull up documentation here in the lower right window. And I'm just interested in generic XY plotting. I don't know what this other thing is all about. So let's click that. So sometimes our documentation can be cryptic. So don't get too hung up in it. But it's all organized the same way, and you'll discover there are some sections of it that can be really helpful. So there's often a description. This usage part can be helpful because it kind of shows you what R is expecting to see when you use this function. And then the arguments tell you a little bit more about what arguments are expected in these places. So this is actually showing you that there's a different way you can use the plot function where you just specify your X, comma, Y, and then that will generate a plot. And then the dot, dot, dot here indicates that there are a bunch of other arguments that you can also include that will kind of develop your plot. So for example, you could have a type argument, type equals L, right, gave us lines on the beaver plot. Type equals B would give us points and lines, et cetera, et cetera. Then we can also put on, labels, so an overall title, main equals, quote, main title, subtitle, X axis and y-axis labels, etc. And for the plot function, there's also notes that there are other arguments buried in the par documentation. That's something we'll touch on later. Then there's some details. Sometimes these are really cryptic, notes. Sometimes see also might head you to something that you're looking for. And then one of the sections I really like is the examples at the bottom. And so these are examples that are standalone that will run. So if you just want to see how this function works, let's try this plot of the sine function. There we go. Okay, so there's a working example with the plot function. So the help documentation can help. The other thing to do, which I didn't put on this slide, is break apart your code. So start with a simple working unit and gradually add in more complexity. If you're running into trouble, take that complexity back out and then gradually add it back in to figure out specifically where your problem is. Now, okay, you're stuck somewhere and an hour's gone by and life has no meaning anymore and you're just totally despondent, nothing's working, it's a complete and utter failure. What do? Don't give up. That is when you need to ask for more help. And if you'd like help from myself or Dr. Burke, here's what you need to do. You need to write a message and include 3 different things in your message. So you need to attach a copy of your script file, so that's saved as an R file, right, with a descriptive name. Attach a copy of your data file for the data in that script, and then try to give us a good description of the error that you are encountering and kind of where you're encountering it. So you'll notice in this code that there are line numbers for each line of code. So you could even say, at line 6, I just can't get that line of code to run. Can you help me figure out what's going on? And the reason to do those things is it will be a lot faster. You'll get an answer a lot faster if you send those things to me up front than if I have to reply and say, okay, can you send me your script? Back and forth, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so hopefully these are all helpful for developing your R FOO. We're going to keep going with R, and by the end of this part of our course, you're going to be pretty good masters of R.